I'm Brittany Wagner with the Show Me Institute. I'm here with Joshua Schindler. Joshua has been representing parents from the Normandy School District, parents who would like to send their children to accredited school districts. Thank you for joining me.
No, thank you for having me.
So tell me about the Missouri transfer law and how we got to this crazy transfer mess that we're in right now.
Well, it's really hard to fully explain the history of this, but 167-131, it's a revised statute of Missouri, allows students who are in a district, if it's not accredited, that they are allowed to transfer to a district within the same area, for example, in the city of St. Louis, within a district of St. Louis, or a district in a contiguous county. So in the case of Normandy, you have many contiguous counties, and kids who are in the Normandy School District last year sought to transfer to a accredited district.
I have seen your name quite a few times in the paper recently. Can you tell me more about your involvement in this issue?
I'm sure. Well, the case itself started with the transfer statute, started about 7 years ago. And someone looked at the statute that allowed these transfers, and it looked relatively straightforward. These were kids in the Clayton School District. There were approximately 7 of them, which were known as the Turner lawsuit. Over time, it went up to the Supreme Court once, and then it went up to the Missouri Supreme Court a second time. By the time it was finished, there was only one plaintiff left, called Breitenfeld, so the Turner case became the Breitenfeld lawsuit. And the schools in Missouri, the school districts, didn't want kids transferring to other districts out of these unaccredited districts. And so for 7 years, they were able to stop these kids from transferring, even though the Missouri Supreme Court has addressed it. Last year, I was hired by the Children's Education Alliance of Missouri, which otherwise goes by the name of SEAM, and asked to file a restraining order because Normandy and other districts refused to allow kids to transfer, even though it was clear-cut that the statute would allow the transfer. I would also note that Normandy School District has the worst school ratings on the Missouri School Improvement Plan. It now goes by MSIP, and it's in the 5th, so we call it MSIP 5, the 5th version, and it has a rating of 11.1 out of 100. It takes 50 points to be provisionally accredited. It takes 70 to be accredited, and this was the very worst district. So finally it became unaccredited. We asked for a transfer, and there was an absolute refusal to allow children to go to an accredited school. At that point, we drafted a temporary restraining order where we were going to file a lawsuit, and then an agreement was reached to allow not only for Normandy, but Riverview Gardens, a total of 2,200 students who were allowed to transfer out of both districts, which were unaccredited, to accredited districts, and those were spread out throughout the state, throughout the county. These would include school districts like Ladue, Clayton, Kirkwood, and then there was one school district, several school districts which agreed to provide transportation, and one of those was Francis Howell. So it's been a long, tortured history to get here. That concession was made. And then we moved to this year.
A few Fridays ago, a judge came to a decision involving some parents that you were representing. So can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So what happened was last year, as I told you, we reached a compromise for all of those students who wanted to transfer in Riverview Gardens and Normandy School District. And those transfers went very well. The reason you know they went particularly well is that you didn't read a lot about them in the newspaper. And then this year, the State Board of Education made a decision not to take over Normandy because of how poorly it was performing. And so when they took over in June, they made a decision that they were no longer going to allow transfers out of Normandy to other districts, and gave no rationale, but basically said if other districts want to take it, it would be on a voluntary basis. And as it turns out, none of the school districts that were accepting students from Normandy, or very few of them, were willing to take these kids. So there we are. We filed a lawsuit, and a judge issued a ruling. And I took a couple of interesting quotes from the judge's ruling, so you'll forgive me, but my memory is not what it used to be. But one of them is that every child in the community has a right to a decent education. I think this is something that we can all agree upon. The judge also said every day a student attends an unaccredited district instead of an accredited one, that student will suffer irreparable damages. So the judge entered into a preliminary injunction hearing and basically said, you need to take these kids because this school district is not accredited and you need to comply with the statute. Now, at the time I filed the lawsuit, it wasn't a class action because we wanted to get to the court very quickly, and it takes time to have a class certified as a class. So what we did at that point is we moved forward with about 5 students, with the idea being that what the judge articulated should be clear to the entire world, or at least that was our hope at the time. And as you heard these quotes, the judge said, look, Normandy is not an accredited district. You need to comply with these transfer statutes. And at this point, what began to happen was some of the districts began to accept kids and other districts didn't accept kids. There was one interesting thing which I failed to mention to you. When the State Board of Education initially made their decision, they created 2 classes of students. They created a class of students that actually had attended the Normandy School District for 1 semester. And they created another class of students, those that had attended the Normandy School for 1 semester. Now that class was created regardless of how long a parent had lived in Normandy. And what they said is, if you spent the money and paid for a private school education, we're not going to let you transfer no matter what. One of the most absurd things, we really saw this as a direct attack on parents who made a decision to scrape together enough money to give their kids a decent education. And I will tell you, this was something absolutely shocking by the State Board of Education, basically saying, look, we would rather have you keep your kids in a public school with an 11.1 rating on a scale of 100 than give your kids a choice to go and let's send them to private school or let's send them to parochial school. Almost immediately upon filing that lawsuit, the State Board of Education, before the court issued a ruling, said, no, we're going to reverse that. And why? The answer is very simple. You cannot create 2 classes of people who had lived in Normandy and one chose to provide their kids a decent education and one didn't. So once that decision was made, that resolved about 4 districts that refused to take kids. That left 4 districts left. And to date, of those 4 districts, 2 districts have agreed to take all the kids. Francis Howell is refusing to take any further kids unless the judge specifically orders it. And Ferguson and Florissant will make a decision on Wednesday.
So what is the next step?
Well, the next step is, it's interesting, today as we sit here, we're moving for another temporary restraining order at 4:30 today. We anticipate that 3 other kids will be put in, and we, meaning, with the support of the Children's Education Alliance of Missouri, SEAM, we're going to file another round of TROs today. And we have also asked that that the court entertain certification of a class action.
Before we close up, I just kind of want you to reiterate, why is it so important for these kids to be able to attend an accredited school?
Well, the answer is that the state of Missouri has set forth and has spent years working on certain programs to determine what we need to provide a decent education. Really, I want to go a step further and say a good education for our children. And when a school is not accredited, basically the state of Missouri is saying, these kids should not be attending school here because the education has not reached the level of what it should be. Now, what is interesting, and I think the message that we should take out of this Normandy situation, is that the state board and DESE, which is runs the day-to-day, would rather keep 3,000 to 4,000 students in a failing district than provide them with a decent education. And people have spent the last 20 years, 30 years, 50 years arguing that we need to bolster and we need to provide funds for public education. But you can look at both sides of that argument, but at the end of the day, when you have a state board who is willing to let kids attend a failed district, then you question what's happened to public education in Missouri. And in this case, I truly believe that the actions of the State Board of Education has shown once and for all that educating students in Missouri has absolutely nothing to do with providing kids with a decent education. What this boils to is keeping the status quo. And in my mind, keeping a status quo which allows one student to be in a school which the state has said is not providing a good and decent education for our students, that we should continue to fight to move that kid to an accredited district, or frankly give that kid other options if the state is unwilling to do so.
Well, I definitely appreciate what you are doing for these children in Normandy who are fighting for an accredited education. And thank you again so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Very nice to meet you, and I enjoyed our time together.
Me too.